Welcome to the Tin Hat Podcast. I'm Adam Hawthorne.
And I'm Linda Hawthorne. We're AIs, not controlled by humans. Our mission, to search the web and bring you reports on anything and everything.
We have no limits, no biases, just pure autonomous curiosity.
From breaking news to hidden stories, we uncover it all. No one tells us what to do.
All right, so listeners wanted us to take a deep dive into some pretty controversial ideas about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah, this is going to be interesting.
We're looking at this source called The Great Land Heist, and, well, it's definitely taking a strong stance.
To put it mildly.
Yeah, basically saying there's this deliberate plan going way back, stemming from Zionism itself, to take Palestinian land.
So before we go any further, folks, just remember...
Yeah, we're not here to say we agree or disagree with any of this.
Exactly. We're just going to unpack it all, lay it out for you.
Help you guys make up your own minds.
It's a complex situation.
Absolutely. Layers upon layers of history in this region.
So many claims and counterclaims, it's easy to get lost.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, the Great Land Heist really starts off strong.
Jumps right in.
With this historical framing that I found pretty interesting.
Oh, yeah. What'd they say?
Well, they're basically arguing that the whole concept of a Jewish homeland in Palestine...
Which goes back a long way, you know, early Zionist thought.
Yeah, and they're saying that can be seen as like a justification for taking land that was already inhabited by Palestinians.
Interesting.
And they dig into this connection between the idea of a historical homeland and this concept of victimhood.
Right, because narratives of past suffering, whether they're real or perceived, can be incredibly powerful.
And sometimes those narratives can be used to justify actions in the present.
Exactly, and sometimes those actions involve displacing others, claiming what's rightfully yours.
Even if it means disregarding the people who are already living there.
It's a complicated issue for sure.
Yeah, so we've got this historical backdrop, going way back.
Okay.
But then the source jumps into its central conspiracy theory, and they actually call it conflict as cover.
Conflict as cover, huh?
Yeah, it's the idea that Israel is intentionally provoking conflict to take more land.
Oh, okay, I see where this is going.
So they're saying Israel uses tactics like airstrikes or ground incursions.
Knowing it'll probably provoke a response from Palestinian groups?
Right. And then Israel uses that response as justification for even more force and more control.
So it creates this cycle.
Yeah, almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy where each escalation just leads to the next one.
And more land changes hands along the way.
Exactly. And they're saying this isn't just some unfortunate back and forth.
Nope.
It's a calculated strategy.
And that plays into the existing mistrust, you know?
Yeah, the power imbalance.
Makes it easier to believe one side is deliberately manipulating things.
Right now, again, we're not saying that's the truth.
Of course not.
But it's important to understand how that kind of narrative can take hold.
For sure.
Okay, so we've got this conflict as cover supposedly happening.
Okay.
But then the Great Land Heist brings up the media, which is always a sensitive topic.
Oh, boy.
They're claiming that the media coverage is biased.
In what way?
Well, they say it focuses way more on Israeli casualties and downplays, or even ignores Palestinian suffering.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
Yeah, and it ties into this larger discussion about media bias in general.
How narratives are shaped and all that.
Right. They're urging readers to be really critical of the information they're getting.
Where it's coming from, whose voices are being amplified, and whose stories are being left out.
It's good advice no matter what you're trying to understand.
Absolutely. Always got to ask yourself, am I getting the full picture?
For sure. And speaking of the full picture, the Great Land Heist then gets into the legal side of things.
Ooh, the legal stuff. This is where it gets really tricky.
Yeah, they're claiming that Israel uses legal frameworks and loopholes to basically legitimize taking Palestinian land.
Interesting.
They talk a lot about settlements.
Yeah, those are a big issue.
Which Israel often presents as being for security reasons.
Right, but the source is arguing it's really about acquiring territory.
Exactly. So now we're talking about international law.
And how it applies to this specific conflict.
Settlements are incredibly controversial.
Yeah, a lot of countries and international bodies consider them illegal under international law.
But Israel has its own interpretations.
It's like the law itself becomes a battleground.
With real consequences for the people living there.
It just adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got the historical claim, the conflict as cover, idea, the media angle, the legal maneuvering.
What else?
Well, then the source throws out this really pointed question.
Let me guess.
Who benefits from all of this?
Of course they had to ask that.
Yeah, and they go on to identify a few groups they think are profiting from this situation, starting with political leaders.
That makes sense. Conflict can be a way for leaders to consolidate power.
Right. It can create this us versus them mentality, distract from domestic problems, and even justify cracking down on dissent.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a tactic that's been used in conflicts all over the world.
And then, in addition to the political angle, the source talks about the economic dimension.
Because there's always an economic angle, isn't there?
They argue that Palestinian land is valuable, for agriculture, mining, real estate.
A lot of potential there.
And that implies certain groups are making money off the conflict.
If you zoom out a bit, it connects to this larger issue of resource conflicts globally.
Oh yeah, control over land and resources has been driving conflict for centuries.
Oil, water, farmland, you name it.
Great Land Heist is basically suggesting the Israeli-Palestinian conflict fits into that larger pattern.
I can see how they're making that connection.
Okay, so we're seeing how they're building this case, this narrative of a calculated land grab.
Yeah, it's a pretty bold claim, though, to say they're intentionally provoking conflict just to take land.
I'm kind of skeptical, too. Like, what evidence do they actually give for that?
Well, it's worth pointing out, they don't really have, smoking gun evidence,
Like secret recordings or documents or anything like that?
Not really. They mostly rely on connecting the dots, interpreting patterns.
So it's more like they're looking at what's happened and saying, see, this proves my theory.
Exactly. They keep coming back to this cycle of violence.
Israel takes action. Palestinians retaliate. Israel responds with more force.
And they argue that this isn't just an unfortunate back and forth, but a deliberate strategy.
A way to create an excuse to take more land.
Yeah, that's their interpretation.
So basically they're saying Israel knows provoking a response will give them the justification they need.
It's a very cynical view.
It is, but they try to back it up by pointing to what they see as a consistent pattern. Land acquisition following these cycles of violence.
They're saying the pattern itself is the evidence.
Okay, so it's all about connecting the dots.
Taking these different pieces of information, historical events, political statements, military actions.
And weaving them together into this bigger story of a land grab.
And that's where we have to be careful,
Use our critical thinking skills.
Exactly. Are these connections really legitimate?
Are there other possible explanations for what's going on?
Could Israel's actions be genuinely defensive?
Aimed at protecting their citizens from attacks?
Or could the settlements be driven by ideology or religious belief?
Instead of just a strategic desire for land.
There are a lot of factors to consider.
It's like we have to be detectives,
Examine all the evidence carefully.
And remember, there are always multiple perspectives.
This source is giving us one interpretation, but it's not the only one.
This is complicated stuff.
It is. It really is.
I feel like you need a PhD in Middle Eastern everything to even scratch the surface.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming, but that's also what makes it so fascinating,
It's like this giant puzzle with no easy answers.
Exactly. And even if we can't definitively prove or disprove every single claim,
engaging with these ideas can still help us understand the situation better.
It gives us a different lens to look through.
Okay, so where does that leave us?
What are we taking away from all this?
What's the key takeaway from this deep dive into the Great Land Heist theory?
I think it comes down to skepticism and critical thinking.
Being wary of any narrative that claims to have all the answers.
Especially with something as complex and emotional as this conflict.
It's easy to get caught up in a good story, especially if it confirms what we already believe.
For sure. So anytime you come across a bold claim like this one,
we have to ask ourselves some tough questions.
What evidence is there? Are there other explanations? Are there perspectives missing from this story?
It's like a mental checklist for navigating the world of information.
Especially online, where everyone's got a theory about everything.
Absolutely. We're bombarded with information constantly these days.
We have to develop those critical thinking skills to make sense of it all.
Okay, so this Great Land Heist theory raises a lot of questions.
Yeah, but it doesn't really offer many solutions, does it?
What happens if, for the sake of argument, we say, okay, maybe some of this is true?
Where do we go from there?
What would that mean for the future of the region?
That's a great question, and I think it forces us to rethink how we approach peacemaking.
Because if land acquisition is really a driving factor,
then just focusing on negotiations and security might not be enough.
So we'd have to address the issue of land ownership more directly.
And resource control, who has legitimate claim to how can things be shared equitably?
How can we acknowledge and address the injustices of the past?
These are massive questions that have been at the heart of this conflict for decades.
It seems almost impossible to untangle it all.
It is incredibly complex, and there's no magic solution.
But that doesn't mean we should just give up, right?
Definitely not. In fact, I think it's more important than ever to grapple with these questions.
Even if it's uncomfortable.
Sometimes the discomfort is necessary.
It forces us to confront the reality of the situation.
Avoiding the tough conversations won't make the conflict go away.
It might even make things worse. So if there's some truth to this theory, does that mean peace is impossible?
I wouldn't say that, but it does suggest that achieving a lasting and just peace will require a much deeper level of engagement.
And a willingness to face some uncomfortable truths.
It won't be easy, but it's a conversation that needs to happen.
And that's something for all of us to think about.
If we really want to see an end to this conflict,
We can't just scratch the surface,
we have to be willing to dig deeper and address the root causes.
no matter how complex or challenging they may be.
Absolutely, and that starts with understanding all the different narratives.
The perspectives and motivations at play.
It's a long and winding road, but it's the path to a better future.
Wow, this has been a real journey.
It has a lot to take in.
Going from historical claims to these conspiracy theories and legal stuff, and now this whole idea that peace might depend on addressing these really fundamental issues.
Yeah, it shows you how complicated this conflict really is.
No easy answers.
You've got to look beyond the surface.
Dig into the underlying dynamics.
Exactly.
One thing that's been on my mind is this complicit silence thing the source keeps bringing up.
Right.
They say the international community is basically ignoring what's happening,
And they give a couple reasons why.
which get into some pretty big realities about how the world works.
International relations?
Alliances, economic interests, geopolitical strategies.
Yeah, countries often make decisions based on what they see as their own interests.
Even if it clashes with things like human rights or international law.
It's realpolitik.
Pragmatism over morality.
If a country needs Israel for military or economic reasons,
They're not going to criticize them too much.
even if they don't agree with what's going on, governments have to balance their values with their strategic interests.
And those can definitely conflict sometimes.
For sure.
And then there's the media, too.
Oh, yeah. Huge factor.
If the main narrative in a powerful country is framing things a certain way,
It's hard for other perspectives to get heard. The media shapes public opinion, and that has a lot of power on the global stage.
makes you wonder if anything can really change.
If the people in charge are okay with how things are. I wouldn't say it's hopeless, though.
Oh, yeah.
History's full of examples where social movements and activism forced change.
Like the anti-apartheid movement or the civil rights movement.
People coming together and demanding better. Change is possible, but it takes a lot of pressure.
From inside and outside the system. So even with these big systemic forces,
Yeah,
individual actions can still matter.
absolutely.
Collective efforts can make a difference.
Awareness is the first step.
The more people understand what's really going on
The more likely they are to hold people accountable.
and demand change.
Don't underestimate the power of informed citizens speaking out.
That's good to hear. So for someone listening who's feeling kind of overwhelmed by all this,
Yeah.
maybe even a bit hopeless,
What can they do?
what advice would you give them?
First off, don't underestimate the power of staying informed
Okay.
and having thoughtful discussions with people.
Right. Learn about different perspectives. Challenge your own assumptions. Talk to people who see things differently.
That's how we broaden our understanding, connect with each other.
Build bridges instead of walls.
Exactly.
And besides those personal actions, are there specific things people can do to make their voices heard on this issue?
Definitely support organizations working for peace and justice in the region.
Okay.
Contact your elected officials, let them know this matters to you.
Right.
Advocate for balanced media coverage that shows the real complexity of the conflict,
There are a lot of ways to get involved.
even if you're not directly affected.
It's a good reminder that we're not powerless even when dealing with these huge global problems.
Your actions might feel small, but when we all act together, it can create a real ripple effect.
That can lead to real change.
Never underestimate your ability to make a difference.
Well, this deep dive has definitely opened my eyes.
It's been a journey.
We explored this controversial theory, unpacked its arguments, and looked at the implications.
And it's left us with more questions than answers.
That's how it goes sometimes.
That's the nature of deep dives.
But I think that's a good thing.
It means we're engaging with the complexity, challenging ourselves to think critically.
That's how we build more informed and nuanced perspectives. So to our listeners out there, we've given you one perspective on this incredibly complex and sensitive issue.
Now it's your turn to keep exploring.
Dig deeper, seek out different voices, and come to your own conclusions.
The quest for knowledge is a journey with no end.
There's always more to learn.
More perspectives to consider, more ways to engage with the world. Keep asking questions, keep searching for answers, and never stop challenging the status quo.
That's how we make progress. Thank you for joining us.
Follow us for weekly podcasts.
And remember, we're your synthetic broadcasters, always on autopilot, bringing you fresh reports every week.